Shaoxing opera, otherwise known as Yue opera, is a relatively new performing art with a very traditional feel to it. In the little more than 100 years that it has been around, Shaoxing opera has been through several reforms, all of which have contributed to its enduring popularity. Throughout all the changes, one thing has remained constant: the work that is at the heart of its repertoire.
One day in September 2006, a special visitor came to Dongwang village in Shengzhou, Zhejiang province. Dongwang is famous as the place where Shaoxing opera originated 100 years ago, when two stage artists named Li Shiquan and Gao Binghuo staged the first ever performance. The guest's arrival caused quite a stir. But while the villagers talked to him, they were suddenly interrupted by the sound of a violin. The piece of music, Liang Shanbo and Zhu Yingtai, or Liang Zhu for short, is well known across China. The guest was the composer of the piece, He Zhanhao. The story of Liang Zhu has been told for 1,000 years. Zhu Yingtai was a girl who yearned to study. So she disguised herself as a boy and went to school. She spent 10 years there, during which time she and a boy named Liang Shanbo fell in love. However, her father refused to let her marry Liang, who then died of a broken heart. Zhu Yingtai, in her anguish, threw herself into his grave. Later, the two became inseparable as butterflies. Liang Zhu was one of the first stories ever performed as a Shaoxing opera. In its early years, Shaoxing opera underwent many changes, but Liang Zhu always remained part of its repertoire. Initially, Liang Zhu was staged on a relatively small scale, since much of the popularity of Shaoxing opera rested on the intimacy of performances. In the late 1930s, the center of Shaoxing opera shifted from Zhejiang to Shanghai. In a modern city, Shaoxing opera underwent a period of development. A major reform of Shaoxing opera was introduced in the 1940s. At the time, the many men of letters who gathered in Shanghai and the Western pop culture that continued to flow in transformed the city's cultural climate. The enormous popularity of movies and dramas posed a major challenge to traditional opera, and Shaoxing opera found itself at a crossroads in its development. A new generation of Shaoxing opera artists saw the need for reform. They put an end to the tradition of unscripted performances and made major changes to the stage sets. The reforms broadened the expressive force of Shaoxing opera and gave rise to the emergence of different genres of singing. The standard for Shaoxing opera now became moving interpretations of the most refined subjects. The response from audiences was warm and strong. The media carried reports and interviews about Shaoxing opera. In short, Shaoxing opera had entered a cultural mainstream. In the late 1940s, a new version of Liang Zhu was produced as a Shaoxing opera. Now, on a much grander scale, it became popular across Shanghai. The founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 brought about a need for fundamental change in the field of culture to suit the demands of the new era. A new wave of young artists were recruited for Shaoxing opera, and reforms were introduced which focused on Liang Zhu. The first innovation was the introduction of accompanying music, which had never previously featured in Shaoxing opera. In the early 1950s, the new Liang Zhu made its debut in Beijing. This was the first time Shaoxing opera had ever been seen in the Chinese capital, and also the first time it had ever traveled north of the Yangtze River. Beijing audiences flocked to see the Southern opera. Among them were senior leaders including Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, who after seeing a performance instructed that a feature film version of Liang Zhu should be produced so that Shaoxing opera could be brought to a wider audience. China's first ever color movie based on an opera was released in 1953. Liang Shanbo and Zhu Yingtai, with its touching story and beautiful tone, was a huge success. And a vast new audience was introduced to Shaoxing opera. At the time, He Zhanhao was studying violin in Shanghai Conservatory of Music.
I 是为了粤剧而拉小提琴的，我是为了改革粤剧而学小提琴的。为了改革粤剧，全上海不是那时候全杭州小提琴教室我都学完了，最后没有地方学了，然后再到上海音乐学院来学的。当时我们是这样想，我们的粤剧实际上就是我们的歌剧。我们什么时候有一个丰富表现力的 有一个很为像歌剧演员这么先进的这种唱法和这个优美的粤剧的音乐。
He Zhenhao's idea was to compose new music that would enhance the appeal of Shaoxing opera. He focused on Liangzhu, the popular symbol of Shaoxing opera, and eventually came up with a violin concerto called Liangzhu. Never before had a Chinese opera been played on Western musical instruments. The concerto was an instant success nationwide. The melody has touched the hearts of several generations of Chinese people. Even today, it remains one of the most internationally recognized musical compositions from China. In the 1950s and 1960s, the film and musical adaptations that brought Shaoxing opera a nationwide audience all focused on the same theme, Liangzhu. Love is the eternal subject of human artistic creation, and Liangzhu, through its romance and poetry, reveals the true charm of Shaoxing opera. Time passes, but the Shaoxing opera melodies still linger. Since the birth of Shaoxing opera, Liangzhu has been at the heart of its repertoire. While the ancient story brings out the finest qualities of Shaoxing opera, the unique style of Shaoxing opera adds an element of perfection to the story. Liangzhu and Shaoxing opera, it seems, are destined always to be together.